The rain had finally ceased after 3 relentless days of Hurricane Harvey's fury. 8-year-old Emma Burns stood on her front porch, the wooden boards still damp beneath her rain boots, watching as the floodwaters receded just enough to reveal the devastated remains of what was supposed to be her new beginning. That's when she saw it, a large German shepherd, coat matted and muddy, struggling through the waterlogged street. The animal moved with desperate determination, its powerful jaws clenched around what appeared to be a heavy canvas bag, dragging it through the debris-littered road. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The dog was clearly exhausted, its legs trembling with each labored step, yet it refused to abandon its mysterious burden. Without thinking, she stepped off the porch, ignoring her father's warnings about staying inside after the storm. "Hey there," she called softly, approaching with the caution her mother had taught her around unfamiliar animals, before the accident that had taken her away forever. The dog froze, amber eyes locking with hers, neither threatening nor retreating. As Emma inched closer, the animal released a sound somewhere between a whine and a groan, and for the first time she noticed the blood mingling with the mud on its right front paw. But what made her young heart truly skip a beat was what spilled partially from the bag, a faded photograph, a sealed envelope, and something that glinted in the weak post-storm sunlight. Whatever this dog was carrying, Emma suddenly understood it wasn't just supplies, it was someone's lifeline. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Emma Burns hadn't smiled much in the 73 days since the car accident. The doctors called it childhood trauma response, but to Robert Burns, it was the unbearable reflection of his own grief mirrored in his daughter's eyes. The move to Millbrook, Texas was supposed to be their fresh start, away from the Pittsburgh apartment filled with Catherine's belongings, away from the pitying glances of neighbors, away from the intersection where ICE and a distracted driver had stolen his wife and Emma's mother in an instant. Yet barely 2 months after unpacking their meager belongings, Hurricane Harvey had swept through, as if to remind them that geography couldn't distance them from tragedy. Emma had always been drawn to animals, but since Catherine's death, this affinity had intensified. Robert often found her speaking softly to birds on the windowsill or leaving food for neighborhood strays, creating connections when human ones seemed too painful. Her school counselor in Pittsburgh had suggested a therapy pet, but Robert couldn't bring himself to replace Catherine's absence with anything, even for Emma's sake. "We need time," he'd tell himself, "just a little more time." Millbrook was the kind of town where families stayed for generations, where folks marked time by floods and droughts rather than calendar years. Many houses still displayed faded photographs of the Great Flood of '94, alongside newer ones from Hurricane Ike. The century-old oak trees lining Main Street had weathered more storms than the oldest resident could recall. It was a community that instinctively circled the wagons during crisis, something neither Emma nor Robert had experienced in their urban life back north. Hurricane Harvey had transformed this tight-knit small town into an archipelago of isolated homes. The elementary school gymnasium now served as an emergency shelter. The corner market operated by flashlight, extending credit to families lost everything. Churches of 3 different denominations coordinated volunteers from a shared list. But beneath this unified front, tensions existed, between old-timers and newcomers, between practical necessity and municipal regulations, between those who believed in rebuilding exactly what was lost, and those who whispered about starting fresh elsewhere. George Parker had lived alone in his modest ranch house since Vietnam took his left leg and Alzheimer's claimed his Martha 5 years ago. At 72, he'd refused evacuation orders with the stubbornness only an Army veteran could muster. Seen worse than wind and water, he'd told the National Guard corporal who'd come knocking. His son Thomas lived 3 hours north in Dallas with his wife Melissa and their boy Jake, who at 6 years old worshipped his Grandpa Grumpy with unbridled devotion. It was for Jake that George maintained his weathered wooden swing set, kept dinosaur-shaped cookies in the pantry, and although he'd never admit it, allowed Max the German Shepherd to sleep inside, despite the dog technically being a stray. Sarah Wilson had taught third grade at Millbrook Elementary for 27 years. The floodwaters had claimed her classroom collection of signed first editions, Sendak, Dahl, White, accumulated over decades of thin teachers' salaries. Her modest home hadn't fared much better, with water reaching the electrical outlets. Yet each morning since the hurricane, she'd arrived at the shelter with her grandmother's percolator, brewing coffee strong enough to fortify the weariest volunteer. Sheriff Mills, born Elton but called Sheriff, even by his wife of 30 years, maintained order with a heavy drawl and heavier boots. His stance on strays had always been firm. The county shelter was overcrowded before the hurricane, and now, with displaced pets everywhere, his deputies had standing orders to impound any animal without clear ownership. "It's for public safety," he'd insist at town meetings, though many suspected it had more to do with the generous county contract granted to his brother-in-law's animal control business. This was the Millbrook Emma encountered, a community of deeply rooted histories and equally deep divisions, where even the simple act of helping a stray dog could entangle a newcomer in decades-old allegiances and resentments. Emma hesitated only a moment before stepping off the porch. Her father was napping, his first real sleep since they'd spent 2 nights huddled in the bathtub while the hurricane howled around them. The German Shepherd had paused at the corner of Cypress Lane, readjusting its grip on the canvas bag, seemingly unaware of the little girl following 20 paces behind. Emma picked her way carefully through the debris, fallen branches, someone's mailbox, a waterlogged teddy bear that made her heart twist with a pang of second-hand loss. "Hey, doggy," she whispered, not wanting to startle the animal. The shepherd's ears twitched, but it continued its determined trek. Its muddy coat couldn't hide the proud lines of its body, though Emma noticed a certain gauntness around its ribs. This wasn't someone's pampered pet. This was an animal that had known hardship before the hurricane ever arrived. As they reached Magnolia Street, Mrs. Delacour was sweeping mud from her front walkway. The elderly woman paused, leaning on her broom when she spotted the dog. "Well, I'll be," she called out to Emma. "Max made it through after all." "You know this dog?" Emma asked, surprised. "Everybody knows Max," Mrs. Delacour replied. "Been around almost as long as old George has. Not quite a pet, not quite wild. Just belongs to Millbrook, I suppose." "He's carrying something," Emma said, pointing to the bag. Mrs. Delacour squinted through her bifocals. "So he is. That's unusual. Where's he headed?" "I'm following to find out," Emma admitted. "That'd be toward George Parker's place, I expect. Corner of Magnolia and Elm. Yellow house with the weather vane. You be careful now." Emma nodded her thanks and continued her pursuit. 2 blocks later, Mr. Tanaka from the hardware store was checking his flooded shed. He too recognized Max, offering a low whistle that made the dog pause momentarily before continuing his mission. "Hasn't been around since before the storm," Mr. Tanaka told Emma. "George was worried sick. Good to see he's alive." "Who's George?" Emma asked, though she was beginning to piece together the connection. "Vietnam vet. Lives alone since his Martha passed. Not the friendliest fellow, but fair. That dog's the closest thing to family he's got in town." Mr. Tanaka eyed the canvas bag with curiosity. "What's he dragging there?" "I'm trying to find out," Emma said, realizing she'd become part of a small community mystery. As they turned onto Elm Street, the houses showed greater damage. One roof had completely collapsed. Another home had its entire contents spilled across the front yard, as if some giant hand had tipped it sideways and shaken it empty. The shepherd navigated the destruction with purpose, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure Emma was still following. The yellow house with the weather vane came into view. Unlike many neighboring properties, it had weathered the storm reasonably well, though blue tarps covered a section of the roof, and a massive oak branch had crushed the front porch railing. Max quickened his pace, his tail giving a slight wag for the first time since Emma had spotted him. A man emerged from around the side of the house, tall and gaunt with silver hair cropped military short. He moved with a distinctive gait, and Emma realized he was using a prosthetic leg. He carried an armload of splintered wood, presumably cleared from his yard, but dropped it immediately when he spotted the dog. "Max?" The name came out somewhere between a shout and a sob. "You stubborn old mutt." The German shepherd broke into a trot, dragging the canvas bag the last 20 yards before dropping it at the man's feet. Max circled excitedly, making the strange chirping whine Emma had heard earlier. The dog pressed against the old man's legs with such force that George Parker had to steady himself against a fence post. "Where have you been, boy?" George knelt awkwardly, his artificial leg extending stiffly, and ran gnarled hands over the shepherd's mud-caked fur, checking for injuries. 3 days gone. Thought the storm took you for sure." It was only when Max stepped aside, nosing the canvas bag, that George noticed the object. His bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "What's this you've brought me?" As George began untying the bag, his weathered face showing equal parts curiosity and concern, he finally noticed Emma standing hesitantly at the edge of his property. "Well now," he said, straightening up with effort, "seems Max brought home more than one stray." His voice was gruff but not unkind. "You lost, little lady?" Emma shook her head. "No, sir. I followed your dog. He was carrying that bag, and he looked like he needed help." Something in George's expression softened slightly. "Did he now? Well, Max has always been a better judge of character than me." He gestured toward the bag. "Want to see what's got him so worked up?" Emma approached cautiously, both curious about the bag's contents and wary of the stranger. Max, however, seemed to welcome her, nudging her hand with his damp nose as she drew near. George loosened the drawstring and opened the canvas bag. Inside was an assortment of items that initially made little sense to Emma. Several cans of food, a flashlight with batteries, a first aid kit, a bottle of prescription medication, and a sealed plastic bag containing what appeared to be photographs and a letter. "Good Lord," George whispered, lifting out the prescription bottle and examining the label. "These are my heart meds, from my emergency kit in the shed." He looked at Max with astonishment. "You broke into the emergency shed and brought me supplies?" The German shepherd sat down, his mission apparently completed, though he kept glancing between George and Emma, as if ensuring they both appreciated the significance of his accomplishment. "He's a rescue dog," George explained, noticing Emma's confused expression, or was before he retired, trained to find people and bring supplies during disasters. The old man's voice caught. "Guess old habits die hard." Emma knelt beside the bag, carefully lifting out the plastic-wrapped photographs. "What are these?" George took them gently, his hands trembling slightly. "Now that," he said quietly, "is something I can't explain. These aren't mine." He extracted a worn photograph showing a young family. A man, woman, and a little boy about Emma's age, with a younger version of Max sitting proudly beside them. "I've never seen these people before in my life." Emma found herself returning to George Parker's yellow house every afternoon that week. Her father had been too consumed with insurance paperwork and phone calls to their landlord in Pittsburgh to notice her brief absences. When she finally confessed where she'd been spending her time, Robert Burns was furious. "You've been going to a stranger's house? Without telling me?" His voice escalated in a way Emma hadn't heard since the hospital waiting room on the night of the accident. "And there's a stray dog there? Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" "Max isn't dangerous," Emma protested, her chin lifting in a gesture Catherine had always called her standing your ground face. "And Mr. Parker is teaching me about his vegetable garden and how the barometer works. He's nice, Dad." "You don't know these people, Emma. This isn't Pittsburgh," Robert said, running a hand through his hair that hadn't seen a proper cut in months. "Things are different here. People are different." "Mom would have liked them," Emma said quietly, and the words hung in the air between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Robert turned away, shoulders hunched. "You're not to go back there. That's final." But the next day, while her father was meeting with FEMA representatives at the community center, Emma slipped out the back door and made her way to Elm Street. She found George on his knees in the side yard, Max vigilantly positioned beside him, as the old man sorted through water-damaged photographs. "My dad says I shouldn't come anymore," she announced without preamble. George nodded slowly, not looking up from his task. "Your father's right to be cautious. He doesn't know me from Adam. But I want to help with Max," Emma insisted, "and figure out who those people in the pictures are." George regarded her thoughtfully. "Sometimes doing right by people means respecting their wishes, even when we don't agree with them." He paused, then added with the hint of a smile. Course, sometimes the right thing and the rule-following thing ain't exactly the same. That's something you gotta figure out for yourself. Emma recognized permission wrapped in plausible deniability when she heard it. She spent that afternoon helping George clean mud from the family photos Max had mysteriously delivered, while the shepherd rested his injured paw on an old towel, watching their work with apparent approval. Meanwhile, across town at the Millbrook Community Center, a heated debate was unfolding. Sheriff Mills stood at the podium, his weathered face set in grim lines. Folks, I understand emotions are running high after what we've all been through. But we've got a public safety issue developing. With the storm damage to the animal shelter, we've got an unprecedented number of strays wandering the streets. We've already had 3 reported dog bites and a child knocked down by a frightened horse someone left untethered near the creek. Sarah Wilson raised her hand. Those were all animals displaced by the flood, Elton. Animals that belong to people who just haven't found them yet. Which is exactly my point, Sarah. The sheriff countered. Until owners claim them, they're strays, and strays are unpredictable, especially after trauma like this. From the back of the room, a voice called out, "This about old George's shepherd, because that dog's been around for years without harming nobody." Sheriff Mills' expression tightened. "This is about enforcing county ordinances that exist for everyone's protection, no exceptions." The meeting dissolved into opposing factions, those insisting on strict enforcement of animal control regulations, and those arguing for compassion toward pets separated from owners during the disaster. By the time Robert Burns arrived looking for the FEMA representative who'd already left, the crowd had largely dispersed. But snippets of conversation reached him. That shepherd actually growled at Davis when he was salvaging lumber from the creek bed. Probably thought he was stealing. Still, a dog that size could take a child's arm off. Robert felt his stomach twist. He hadn't seen many German shepherds in town, and the description matched the dog Emma had been so enchanted by. He hurried home, only to find the house empty and his daughter nowhere in sight. While the town meeting dispersed, Emma was making a discovery. Carefully pulling apart the water-damaged photographs, she found a letter sealed in plastic. The water had seeped in despite the protection, making some of the ink run, but the message was still legible. "If you're reading this, something has happened to us. Max knows where to go in emergencies. He's been trained. Please tell Jake we love him, and we're sorry we couldn't keep our promise to come back. The key to the safe deposit box is inside Max's collar tag. It unscrews. Everything we have is for Jake now. Please find him. Please tell him we fought to the end to get home. Michael and Diane Wilson." "Wilson," Emma whispered. "Like Miss Wilson from the school?" George, who had been reading over her shoulder, straightened suddenly. "Sarah Wilson, the teacher?" Emma nodded. "She's staying at the shelter because her house flooded really bad." George looked at Max, who had perked up at this exchange. "Is that where you were trying to go, boy? To Sarah Wilson's house? But it was underwater, wasn't it?" The dog whined softly, ears flattening. "Who's Jake?" Emma asked, scanning the letter again. "I don't rightly know," George admitted, "but I'm guessing Max does." He reached for the shepherd's collar, examining the metal tag that hung from it. Indeed, the circular tag twisted apart, revealing a small safety deposit key inside. The significance of Max's actions began to sink in. The dog hadn't been randomly scavenging. He'd been executing a specific mission, delivering emergency supplies to George, a familiar safe harbor, while carrying vital information about his original owners and a child named Jake. The German shepherd wasn't just a stray that had adopted the town of Millbrook. He was a highly trained service animal with a purpose that extended beyond anyone's understanding. At that moment, the back gate creaked open, and Robert Burns stormed into the yard, his face a mask of fury and fear. "Emma Catherine Burns, you deliberately disobeyed me." Max leapt to his feet, positioning himself between Emma and this perceived threat, a low growl building in his throat. "Call off your dog, mister," Robert demanded, freezing in place. "Max, easy," George commanded, and the shepherd fell silent, though he remained vigilant. "Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The misunderstanding is my 8-year-old daughter thinking it's acceptable to sneak off to a stranger's home against explicit instructions, Robert retorted, reaching for Emma's hand. But Emma clutched the letter. Dad, wait, we found something important. Max isn't just a stray, he belongs to someone, and he's trying to help a little boy named Jake. The tension in the yard crystallized into something new. A pivotal moment where grief and fear collided with mystery and purpose, forever altering the trajectory of lives that had intersected, only because of one determined dog and the storm that had brought them together. It took 45 minutes of careful explanation, 2 cups of George's bitter instant coffee, and Max's eventual relaxation around Robert before Emma's father began to understand the magnitude of what they'd discovered. The letter, water-damaged but legible, suggested a family in crisis, a child named Jake who might be orphaned, and a dog who had undertaken an impossible journey to fulfill his training. By the time twilight settled over George's backyard, a tentative alliance had formed. So you're saying this Sarah Wilson might know who these people are? Robert asked, turning the key from Max's collar tag over in his palm. Small town like Millbrook, if these Wilsons are related to Sarah, she'd know, George confirmed. Been teaching here almost 30 years. Robert looked at his daughter, who sat cross-legged on the ground beside Max, her small hand resting on the shepherd's damp fur. Something in the scene, perhaps the protective posture of the dog or the quiet contentment on Emma's face, reminded him of Catherine. His late wife had always moved instinctively toward healing broken things, a quality he now recognized in their daughter. We'll go to the shelter tomorrow, Robert decided. Find Miss Wilson and show her the letter. Emma's face brightened. Really? Can Max come too? Robert and George exchanged wary glances. Better not, George said. Sheriff's been making noise about rounding up strays. On the walk home, Robert listened as Emma chattered about Max's intelligence, George's vegetable seeds preserved in glass jars, and the hurricane preparedness tips the old veteran had shared. His daughter was speaking more in these few minutes than she had in the weeks since Catherine's funeral. Something had awakened in her, a sense of purpose that had been dormant in their shared grief. That night, as Robert checked on Emma before bed, he found her hunched over their kitchen table, surrounded by markers and poster boards salvaged from their flooded garage. What's this? He asked. Posters for Max, she explained, not looking up from her work. So people know he's not dangerous. Robert examined her creation, a crayon drawing of the German Shepherd beside block letters proclaiming Max is a hero, not a stray. The childish rendering somehow captured the dignified slope of the dog's ears, the intelligent gleam in his eyes. That's actually quite good, he said, surprised. Catherine had been the artistic one, not him. Mom taught me about proportions, Emma said matter-of-factly. Before. Robert swallowed hard. Want some help? I'm not much of an artist, but I can cut straight lines. They worked side by side for an hour, creating 6 posters. Something shifted between them. A small breach repaired in the dam of grief that had separated father and daughter. As Emma's eyelids grew heavy, Robert carried her to bed, carefully tucking the blanket around her shoulders. Dad? She murmured sleepily. Yes, sweetheart? Mom would have loved Max too, wouldn't she? Robert felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied any mention of Catherine, but for once, it didn't overwhelm him. Yes, he said softly. She absolutely would have. Dawn broke the next morning with renewed purpose. Robert and Emma arrived at the elementary school gymnasium, where displaced families still camped on cots and air mattresses. Sarah Wilson was easy to spot, a trim woman in her 50s with prematurely silver hair, efficiently organizing breakfast distribution for shelter residents. Miss Wilson? Emma approached before her father could formulate a more tactful introduction. Do you know anyone named Michael and Diane Wilson, who have a son named Jake and a German Shepherd named Max? Sarah's hands froze in the act of pouring coffee. Where did you hear those names? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Robert stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. I apologize for the abruptness. I'm Robert Burns, and this is my daughter Emma. We've found something you should see. They settled in a quiet corner of the gymnasium, where Robert produced the letter and key. Sarah's hands trembled as she read, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Michael was my nephew, she finally said. He and Diane lived up near Houston with their son Jake. Michael trained search and rescue dogs for a living. She touched the photograph reverently. When Harvey hit, they were cut off by flooding. Last I heard, they were trying to evacuate by boat. She looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. The Coast Guard found their capsized boat 3 days ago, but no sign of anyone. But Jake wasn't with them? Emma asked, hope threading through her voice. Sarah shook her head. Jake's been with his other grandparents in San Antonio since the school year started. Michael and Diane were supposed to join him once they got their animals out. She stared at the letter again. Max must have been with them when whatever happened. And he made it all this way, Robert marveled. From Houston to Millbrook. Almost 60 miles, Sarah confirmed. Through flood conditions. It's impossible. Not for Max, Emma said with absolute conviction. Within hours, Sarah Wilson had contacted Michael's parents in San Antonio, confirming that 6-year-old Jake was safe but devastated by the uncertainty surrounding his parents' fate. The Coast Guard had officially transitioned from rescue to recovery operations, which everyone understood was a polite way of saying they were now searching for bodies, not survivors. The poor boy keeps asking about Max, Sarah explained later that day as she, Robert, Emma, and George sat on George's newly repaired porch steps. He doesn't understand why his parents would leave the dog behind. Max has been Jake's companion since he was a puppy. How'd he end up here in Millbrook with George? Robert wondered aloud. George cleared his throat. Been thinking on that. About 2 years back, a training group used the old fairgrounds outside town for some kind of disaster response practice. SAT had all manner of emergency vehicles, volunteer victims, the works. I recall they had dogs with them. Might be Max was part of that exercise, got to know the area. And he remembered it was safe, Emma concluded. When everything else was underwater, he knew where to go. The conversation paused as they watched Max navigating the yard, occasionally nosing aside debris to inspect the ground beneath. Despite his recent ordeal, the shepherd maintained an alert, purposeful demeanor. What happens to him now? Emma asked, the question hanging heavy in the afternoon air. Sarah sighed. Legally, he belongs to Jake. But Jake's grandparents live in a retirement community that doesn't allow pets, especially ones this size. The boy's lost his parents, George stated flatly. Shouldn't lose his dog too. Robert found himself nodding in agreement, surprising himself. 2 days ago, he'd been adamantly opposed to Emma's connection with the shepherd. Now, watching the animal methodically patrolling George's property, protecting it in his canine way, Robert began to understand what his daughter had seen immediately. Maybe we can help, he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. I'm a contract lawyer, or was back in Pittsburgh. I could look into establishing some kind of guardianship arrangement for Max, at least temporarily. 3 pairs of eyes turned to him with varied expressions of surprise. You'd do that? George asked. Robert shrugged, oddly embarrassed by their attention. It seems important. That evening, as news of Max's extraordinary journey spread through Millbrook's recovery grapevine, people began appearing at George's gate. Mrs. Delacour brought a home-cooked meal large enough to feed all of them. Mr. Tanaka arrived with materials to properly patch George's roof. 2 teenagers from the high school offered to help clear the remaining debris from the yard. Each visitor asked to see Max, to hear the full story, to touch some small part of the miracle that had emerged from the disaster. While the adults shared recovery stories on the porch, Emma sat with her posters and a growing petition. Save Max, it read at the top, followed by a simplified version of the shepherd story. As she carefully logged each signature, Emma felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her. Not happiness exactly, but purpose. She had spent months feeling powerless against the enormity of her loss. Now, focused on saving one dog who had already saved himself against impossible odds, she felt something like her old self returning. By the end of the week, Sheriff Mills could no longer ignore the groundswell of support for Millbrook's hero dog, as the local paper had dubbed Max. When he arrived at George's house on official business, he found himself confronted by Emma, petition in hand, flanked by a surprising ally, Robert Burns, in a crisp button-down shirt, looking every inch the corporate attorney he had once been. Sheriff Mills, Robert greeted him with professional courtesy. "I understand you're here about Max." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "County ordinance is clear. Strays need to be impounded, assessed, and either returned to owners or processed for adoption." He glanced at the shepherd sitting alertly beside George. "Given the circumstances, I'm willing to expedite the process, but the law's the law." "Interesting you should mention the law," Robert replied smoothly, withdrawing a folder from his messenger bag. "I've been reviewing Texas statutes regarding service animals and working dogs. Max falls squarely into those protected categories, having been professionally trained for search and rescue operations." He handed over several highlighted documents. "Furthermore, as you can see from this notarized statement from Sarah Wilson, legal proceedings are already underway to establish a guardianship arrangement for the animal on behalf of his legal owner, a minor child currently residing in San Antonio." Sheriff Mills scanned the documents, his frown deepening. "This all seems mighty convenient, Mr. Burns." "Not convenient, Sheriff. Necessary." Robert gestured toward Emma, who stood clutching her petition with white-knuckled determination. "My daughter and others in this community recognize something I believe you're overlooking. In times of crisis, compassion shouldn't be sacrificed to bureaucracy." Whether it was the legal documents, the community pressure, or simply the steady gaze of the German shepherd in question, Sheriff Mills ultimately departed without Max, though not without a warning. "Any aggressive behavior from that animal, and all the petitions in Texas, won't stop me doing my job." As the sheriff's cruiser disappeared down Elm Street, Emma threw her arms around her father's waist. "That was amazing. You sounded just like the lawyers on TV." Robert laughed, a genuine laugh that startled them both with its unfamiliarity. "Well, I wasn't always just your dad, you know." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A silver SUV with San Antonio plates pulled into George's driveway, and Sarah Wilson emerged, accompanied by an elderly couple and a small boy with a mop of dark hair and red-rimmed eyes. "They insisted on coming as soon as they heard," Sarah explained hastily to George and Robert, who had been repairing a fence section together. "This is my brother James and his wife Helen, Michael's parents. And this is Jake." The boy stood half hidden behind his grandmother, gaze fixed on the ground. His small shoulders were hunched beneath a too large Houston Astros jersey, his sneakers scuffed and untied. "Where's Max?" he asked in a voice so small it was nearly inaudible. As if summoned by his name, the German shepherd appeared from around the corner of the house. For a moment, the dog froze, every muscle tensed as he stared at the child. Then, with a high-pitched whine unlike anything they had heard before, Max bounded across the yard. Jake broke free from his grandmother's protective hand and ran toward the shepherd with equal speed. They met in the middle of the yard, the boy throwing his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick fur. Max circled frantically, whining and licking the child's face, neck, hands, anywhere he could reach, his entire body quivering with joy. "He was with them," Jake sobbed into Max's ruff. "He was with Mom and Dad. He knows where they are." A heavy silence fell over the adults watching this reunion. The terrible truth that Max had likely witnessed the tragic end of Jake's parents hung in the air, impossible to voice aloud to a 6-year-old whose world had already collapsed. It was Emma who stepped forward, who knelt beside the boy and his dog on the muddy grass. "Max came a really long way to find people who could help him get back to you," she said gently. "He's the bravest dog I've ever met." Jake lifted his tear-streaked face. "Did he bring anything from my mom and dad? Did they send a message?" Emma glanced uncertainly at the adults, seeking guidance. Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly, and Robert moved to retrieve the plastic-sealed letter from inside the house. "Yes," Emma said, taking Jake's small hand in hers. "They sent you the most important message of all." Later, as twilight softened the edges of the hurricane-battered landscape, Jake sat on George's porch steps, one arm draped over Max's broad shoulders, the dog pressed protectively against his side. The boy had read his parents' letter a dozen times already, fingers tracing the water-smeared words that represented their final communication. Though too young to fully comprehend the legal implications of the safe deposit key, he understood the essential truth. His parents had fought until the end to return to him, and when they couldn't, they had sent Max in their place. Inside the house, the adults spoke in low, serious tones about practicalities. James and Helen Wilson couldn't keep Max in their retirement community. George's health made permanent adoption unrealistic. Sarah's rental agreement explicitly prohibited pets. "He needs to be with Jake," George insisted. "Plain as day, that dog's mission in life is protecting that boy." "We know," Helen Wilson said, her voice cracking. "But we've already had to move to a smaller unit to afford Jake's therapy. The retirement village won't bend their rules, even after everything that's happened." Robert, who had been quietly listening, cleared his throat. What if there was another option? 4 pairs of eyes turned toward him expectantly. "Emma and we have space. Our rental has a fenced yard. I'm working remotely now, so I'm home most days." He paused, surprised by his own suggestion. It wouldn't be permanent, but it could give everyone time to figure out a long-term solution. "You'd do that?" James asked, his grief-lined face showing the first flicker of relief. "For a dog you just met? For our family?" Robert glanced out the window, where Emma had joined Jake on the porch steps. She was showing him her drawings of Max, and the boy was nodding with increasing animation, occasionally correcting a detail about the shepherd's appearance or habits. Despite the weight of tragedy surrounding them, there was a momentary lightness in the interaction. 2 children connected by loss, finding common ground through their shared love of one remarkable dog. "Yes," Robert said simply. "I think Catherine would have wanted it this way." Outside, unaware of the adults' discussion, Emma watched as Jake demonstrated how he had taught Max to retrieve specific objects by name: ball, rope, medicine, help. The shepherd performed each command flawlessly, his focus on the boy absolute, despite the obvious fatigue still evident in his movements. "He came all this way just to deliver that letter?" Jake asked, his young face solemn with the effort of processing such loyalty. Emma considered this. "I think he came all this way to keep his promise to your parents," she said carefully. "They asked him to find you, and he did the best he could." Jake nodded, absorbing this with the peculiar wisdom of children facing adult realities. "Max always keeps his promises," he said, threading his fingers through the shepherd's fur. "Dad said that's why he's the best rescue dog ever, because he never gives up." As the evening deepened into night and the adults continued their discussions inside, Emma and Jake remained on the porch with Max standing sentinel beside them, his amber eyes reflecting the resilience that had carried him through floodwaters and devastation to fulfill his final mission. The arrangement seemed perfect, at least on paper. Jake would stay with his grandparents in San Antonio while they sorted through the legal aftermath of his parents' presumed deaths. Max would live temporarily with Emma and Robert in Millbrook, with regular video calls between boy and dog, and weekend visits whenever possible. George offered his home as neutral territory for these reunions, his gruff exterior softening visibly around both children. For 3 weeks, a fragile new normal established itself. Robert filed the necessary legal paperwork to formalize their temporary guardianship of Max. Emma's nightmares, which had plagued her since Catherine's death, subsided with the German shepherd sleeping vigilantly outside her bedroom door. Even Sheriff Mills grudgingly acknowledged the dog's model behavior, though he insisted on Max wearing a bright orange service animal vest when in public spaces. Then came the weather alert. Robert's phone blared the emergency tone at 5:37 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October. The National Weather Service was tracking another low-pressure system in the Gulf, strengthening rapidly and shifting course toward the Texas coast. Not another Harvey. The meteorologists were careful to emphasize that, but a significant threat to communities still recovering from the previous disaster. By noon, Millbrook's emergency management team had established an evacuation schedule. By 3 o'clock, families on the eastern side of town, nearest the creek that had overflowed so catastrophically during Harvey, were loading vehicles with hastily packed essentials. Robert, whose rental home sat on slightly higher ground, received notice they should be prepared to leave by the following morning. "I don't want to go," Emma declared, standing in their kitchen surrounded by half-filled boxes. Max sat beside her, his posture mirroring her stubbornness. "What about George? He won't leave, will he?" Robert sighed, setting down the weather radio he'd been monitoring. George is an adult who makes his own decisions, however stubborn they might be. We're going to the shelter in Austin, where it's safe. But Max comes with us, Robert interrupted firmly. That was our agreement with Jake's grandparents. He's our responsibility. Emma seemed temporarily satisfied with this answer and returned to her packing. Robert stepped onto the front porch, surveying the gray-green sky. The wind had picked up considerably in the past hour, bending the tops of the pine trees that lined their street. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Wilson. Coast Guard confirms storm strengthening. Could make landfall by tomorrow evening. James and Helen asking if they should come get Max now? Robert typed a quick reply. No need. He's coming with us to Austin Shelter. We'll keep them updated. As he pressed send, a county emergency vehicle drove slowly down their street, an officer calling evacuation instructions through a bullhorn. The crackling announcements carried away on the gusting wind, creating an eerie, disjointed effect that raised the hair on Robert's arms. Inside, he found Emma in her bedroom, solemnly packing her backpack with items clearly selected for their significance rather than practicality. Her mother's scarf, the family photo album rescued from their flooded garage, the drawings she had made of Max. Just essentials, sweetheart, Robert reminded her gently. We won't have much space in the car. These are essentials, Emma insisted, her jaw set in that familiar way that made her look so much like Catherine that Robert's chest ached. He didn't have the heart to argue. Fair enough, just make sure you have clean clothes and your toothbrush too. By evening, the sky had darkened to a bruised purple, and rain began to fall in fat, sporadic drops that seemed to sizzle on the overheated pavement. Robert loaded their car while Emma fed Max, the shepherd, unusually restless, pacing between the windows and the door with increasing agitation. He knows something's wrong, Emma observed, watching Max's tense body language. Animals can sense changes in barometric pressure, Robert explained, trying to sound reassuringly scientific. He's picking up on our stress too. Their landline phone rang, a rarity, as few people had that number. Robert answered to find George on the line, his voice barely audible through the static. Heard you folks are evacuating tomorrow, the old veteran said without preamble. That's the plan. You should too, George. A dry chuckle crackled through the connection. Rode out worse than this in Nam, just calling to check if you need anything before you go. Got some extra batteries and bottled water if you're short. We're all set, but thanks. What about you? Is your roof secure after the repairs? Tight as a drum, George assured him. Listen, tell Emma not to worry about an old man, and take good care of Max. That boy Jake called me today, all worked up about the storm. Had to promise him twice I'd make sure his dog was safe. As if summoned by his name, Max suddenly barked, a sharp, authoritative sound unlike his usual communication. He stood rigid at the front door, ears forward, muscles tensed. I think Max is ready for his evening walk, Robert told George. We'll check in once we reach Austin tomorrow. Godspeed, George replied, and the line went dead. Outside, the wind had intensified, sending debris skittering along the street, fallen branches, discarded evacuation notices, someone's forgotten tarp. Max pulled at his leash with uncharacteristic force, trying to lead Robert east, away from their usual route. Not tonight, boy, Robert said firmly, tugging the shepherd toward the small park where they normally completed a quick circuit before bedtime. Quick business trip and back inside. Max reluctantly complied, though his attention remained divided, his head continually swiveling to look back the way he had wanted to go. They had barely completed half their usual loop when the first emergency siren wailed across town, its mournful rise and fall sending a chill through Robert despite the muggy evening air. Back at the house, Robert found Emma in the living room, the television tuned to the local news. The meteorologist's grave face filled the screen as he gestured to radar images showing a tightening spiral of storm clouds. Accelerated timeline, with the system intensifying more rapidly than initially projected. Landfall now expected before dawn, with tropical storm force winds reaching coastal communities within the next 4 to 6 hours. Emergency management officials in the following counties have upgraded evacuation orders from voluntary to mandatory. Robert felt his mouth go dry as the list of counties scrolled across the bottom of the screen, including their own. He reached for his phone just as it buzzed with an emergency alert. Mandatory evacuation order. All residents must evacuate by 10 p.m. Shelter at Millbrook High School open for those needing transportation assistance. Dad? Emma's voice sounded small against the television's urgent broadcast. Change of plans, Robert said, striving for calm he didn't feel. We're leaving tonight instead of tomorrow. As they rushed to finish loading the car, the rain intensified, driven sideways by strengthening winds. Max grew increasingly agitated, barking at the door, then running to Emma's side, then back to the door in a clear display of distress. He's scared, Emma said, trying to comfort the shepherd. He'll settle once we're on the road, Robert assured her, though he wasn't convinced. Something about the dog's behavior seemed less like fear and more like insistence. By 9:30, they were ready to leave. The streets had emptied of all but emergency vehicles, and the pounding rain reduced visibility to mere yards. Robert ushered Emma toward the car. Max's leash gripped tightly in his other hand. Then Emma's phone rang, the special ringtone she had assigned to video calls from Jake. She glanced questioningly at her father, who nodded despite his urgency to get on the road. Some allowances had to be made for a boy who had already lost so much. "Hi, Jake," Emma answered, huddling with the phone under the meager shelter of their front porch. Max immediately pressed against her, nosing at the screen where Jake's face appeared. "Is Max okay?" the boy asked without greeting. His face pale in the glow of his grandparents' living room lights. "There's another hurricane coming." "Not a hurricane," Emma corrected automatically, having absorbed her father's careful explanations. "Just a tropical storm. And yes, we're evacuating right now. Max is coming with us to Austin." Jake's face crumpled with visible relief. "I was so scared. Grandma said you'd take care of him, but I kept thinking about Mom and Dad in their boat." And he broke off, unable to complete the thought. "Max is right here," Emma said quickly, turning the phone so Jake could see the shepherd. "See? He's totally safe." Max whined softly at the sight of Jake, paws dancing in apparent frustration at not being able to reach through the screen. "Dad says I can come visit next weekend if the roads are okay," Jake continued. "Mr. George said we could." The boy's voice cut off as Emma's phone screen went black. She stared at it in confusion before realizing the power had gone out, not just in their house, but up and down the street. The sudden darkness was absolute and disorienting. "Dad?" Emma called, her voice rising with the first edges of panic. "I'm right here," Robert answered, fumbling for the flashlight in his pocket. "Battery's probably just drained. Let's get in the car." The beam from his flashlight caught Max's eyes, reflecting an eerie golden glow. The shepherd stood unnaturally still, head cocked as if listening to something beyond human perception. Then, without warning, he lunged forward with such force that the leash slipped from Robert's rain-slicked hand. "Max!" Emma cried as the dog bounded into the darkness, quickly disappearing beyond the flashlight's reach. "Stay here," Robert ordered, pressing the car keys into Emma's palm. "Get in the car and lock the doors. I'll find him." Emma clutched the keys, torn between obedience and the desperate urge to follow Max herself. "But Dad..." "Emma, please." The naked fear in her father's voice silenced her protests. "I'll be right back." Robert plunged into the rain after the German shepherd, calling the dog's name against the rising howl of the wind. His flashlight beam bounced crazily off the rain-slicked pavement, creating more shadows than illumination. He followed what he thought was the direction of Max's flight, toward the eastern edge of town, toward George's neighborhood. 15 minutes of desperate searching yielded nothing. The storm's intensity increased with every passing moment, and Robert knew with growing certainty that they had missed their safe window for evacuation. He turned back toward their house, resigned to spending the night at the high school shelter instead. As he approached their driveway, his flashlight caught a horrifying sight. Their car sat empty, its driver's door hanging open. Of Emma, there was no sign. "Emma!" Robert screamed, his voice lost in the wind. He ran to the car, finding only her backpack on the seat and the keys in the ignition. With rising panic, he searched the house, the backyard, the street. Nothing. Then he saw it. A sheet of notebook paper anchored to the refrigerator with a butterfly magnet, Emma's careful handwriting visible even in the feeble flashlight beam. "Dad, Max went to help someone. I know where he's going. I'll be at Mr. George's house. Don't worry. But Robert did worry, with the frantic, all-consuming terror that only a parent could understand. His daughter was out in a tropical storm, following a dog on some instinctive mission that made sense only to the animal. He ran back to the car, hands shaking so badly he could barely insert the key. Across town, Emma slogged through puddles already reaching mid-calf, her raincoat plastered against her small frame. She had followed Max at a distance, struggling to keep his dark form in sight against the storm-black landscape. The shepherd moved with certainty through the chaos, occasionally looking back as if to ensure she was still following, but never slowing his urgent pace. They were nearing George's street when Emma heard it, a sound somehow distinct from the storm's cacophony, a voice calling for help, thin and strained. Max heard it too. The shepherd broke into a run, splashing through deepening water toward a drainage ditch that ran alongside Elm Street. Emma hurried after him, her heart pounding with fear and determination. The flashlight she had grabbed from the kitchen drawer revealed a horrifying scene. The ditch, now a raging torrent from the rain, had partially collapsed the earth beneath George's driveway. His pickup truck had slid halfway into the resulting sinkhole, its headlights still glowing weakly underwater. George himself clung to the truck's side mirror, his prosthetic leg apparently caught in the vehicle's twisted frame. "Mr. George," Emma screamed, dropping to her knees at the edge of the ditch. "Hold on." The old veteran looked up, shock registering on his rain-streaked face. "Emma? What in God's name? You shouldn't be here." Max was already in motion, leaping into the water without hesitation. The current caught him immediately, but the powerful dog fought against it, swimming toward George with the same determination that had carried him 60 miles through hurricane floodwaters. "No, Max," George shouted. "Get the girl to safety." But the shepherd ignored the command, focusing entirely on reaching the trapped man. When he finally made it to the truck, he gripped George's shirt sleeve in his teeth, trying to provide additional support against the pulling current. Emma knew she couldn't pull George out herself. The water was too strong, the man too heavy. She needed help. With shaking hands she pulled out her phone, but in the darkness and confusion, she dropped it into the swirling water. "Emma, listen to me," George called over the storm's roar. "My house, back door key under the ceramic frog, phone on the kitchen counter, call 911. "I can't leave you," she cried. "You have to," George insisted. "I've got Max. We'll hold on." The decision was impossible. Stay with them, but help, or leave to find help but risk them being swept away in her absence. As Emma hesitated, the truck shifted with a sickening groan of metal, sinking deeper into the widening hole. George's grip on the mirror slipped, and he cried out in pain as his trapped leg twisted. In that moment, headlights cut through the darkness behind them. Emma turned to see her father's car skidding to a stop, Robert already leaping out into the rain. "Dad," she screamed. "Help! Mr. George is trapped." Robert assessed the situation with one horrified glance. "Emma, in the car, now!" For once, she didn't argue, recognizing that her presence complicated the rescue. As she scrambled toward relative safety, Robert waded into the edge of the churning water, quickly determining he couldn't reach George directly. "Hang on," he shouted to the older man. "I'm calling for help." Max, still in the water beside George, barked sharply, once, twice, 3 times. Not a panicked sound, but the distinct pattern of his trained alert. "He's saying I don't have time," George called, understanding the shepherd's signal. "Water's rising too fast." Robert looked frantically around for anything that might help. His gaze fell on the tow strap in the back of his SUV, a purchase he'd made just days ago after seeing too many cars stranded during Harvey. In seconds, he had secured one end to his vehicle's frame and was unspooling the other end toward the ditch. "Max," he called, holding out the strap's end with its heavy metal hook. "Bring this to George." The German shepherd responded instantly to the command, swimming toward Robert to take the strap in his powerful jaws, then turning back toward George. Fighting against the current, Max delivered the lifeline to the stranded man. With painful slowness, George secured the hook to his belt. "It'll pull my leg free or tear it off," he shouted grimly. "Either way, get ready to haul me in." Robert nodded, sliding behind the wheel of his car. He eased it forward until the strap went taut, then pressed the accelerator with agonizing restraint, applying steady pressure rather than a sudden jerk. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound of tearing metal audible even above the storm, George came free from the truck. The sudden release sent him and Max both tumbling in the current, but the tow strap held, allowing Robert to slowly winch them toward the bank. Emma, watching from the car, saw her father leap back into the rain to help drag George's half-submerged body from the ditch. Max scrambled up beside them, water streaming from his fur as he stood vigilant guard over the rescue operation. By the time emergency responders arrived, guided by Emma's call from George's house, all four were huddled in Robert's running car. Wet, shaken, but alive. As paramedics transferred George to an ambulance, the old veteran gripped Robert's arm with surprising strength. "That dog," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion, "came scratching at my door right as the ground started giving way. Tried to pull me back from the truck when I went to move it. When I fell in, he kept me above water till you came." His rheumy eyes moved to Max, who sat protectively beside Emma in the back seat. "That ain't just training. That's something else entirely." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle carefully navigated the flooded street, Robert turned to Emma, prepared to deliver the lecture of a lifetime about disobeying safety instructions during an emergency. The words died on his lips when he saw her face, not frightened or apologetic, but fiercely proud, her arm wrapped around Max's damp shoulders. "He knew," she said simply, "just like he knew about the letter for Jake. He knew Mr. George needed help." Robert looked at the German shepherd, who met his gaze with that unnerving canine intelligence. For the first time, he truly understood what his daughter had recognized instantly. This was no ordinary dog, and their lives had been permanently altered from the moment Max had dragged that canvas bag down their flooded street. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind less devastation than feared, but enough to further strain Millbrook's already taxed recovery resources. George was admitted to the county hospital with a broken ankle, torn ligaments, and the grim diagnosis of pneumonia developing in his 72-year-old lungs. Emma, Robert, and Max took shelter at the high school gymnasium, along with other families who hadn't evacuated in time, their home temporarily inaccessible due to downed power lines on their street. Word of Max's heroism spread through the shelter like wildfire. How the German shepherd had alerted Emma, led her through the storm to George, and helped save the old veteran from drowning. Even Sheriff Mills seemed impressed, stopping by their cot area with an approving nod toward the exhausted dog curled protectively around Emma's sleeping form. "That's one remarkable animal you've got there," the sheriff acknowledged gruffly. "Seems I might have been hasty in my judgment." Robert, running on coffee and adrenaline after a sleepless night, managed a tired smile. "He continues to surprise us all." When the roads cleared enough for limited travel, Robert's first priority was checking on George at the hospital. With Max wearing his service vest, no one questioned his right to enter the facility after the stories that had circulated. They found the old veteran propped up in a bed, oxygen tubes in his nose and his complexion an alarming gray. "Well, if it isn't my rescue party," George rasped, his voice weaker than any of them had heard before. His gnarled hand reached out to stroke Max's head, as the shepherd placed his muzzle gently on the edge of the bed. "Been telling the nurses about our adventure. They think I'm delirious." Emma perched carefully on the visitor's chair beside him. "Are you going to be okay, Mr. George?" Something flickered across the old man's face, a shadow of knowledge he seemed reluctant to share. "Just need some rest, little lady. Lungs ain't what they used to be after 40 years of camels." The doctor's assessment, delivered while George napped and Emma was occupied with the vending machines down the hall, was considerably less optimistic. "The pneumonia is aggressive," Dr. Patel explained quietly to Robert. "Given his age and the condition of his heart, we're quite concerned. We've started him on IV antibiotics, but you should prepare yourself and the little girl for the possibility that Mr. Parker may not recover from this." Robert glanced through the doorway at George's sleeping form, oxygen mask now replaced over his face, monitoring equipment beeping softly beside him. "He's a fighter." "Yes," Dr. Patel agreed, "but sometimes even fighters need to rest." That evening, while Robert made arrangements for contractors to check their home's electrical system, Sarah Wilson arrived at the hospital with unexpected news. Jake's grandparents are driving in from San Antonio, she told Emma, who sat cross-legged on the floor of George's room, sketching pictures to decorate his stark hospital walls. They'll be here tomorrow afternoon. Max, who'd been dozing beside Emma, lifted his head at Jake's name, ears perking forward with interest. Really? Emma brightened momentarily, then her expression clouded. Is it because of Mr. George? Did they hear he's sick? Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Partly, but also because Jake's been having nightmares since the second storm. He keeps saying Max is calling him, that something's wrong. She lowered her voice, though George remained asleep. I think they're hoping seeing Max safe and sound will help calm him down. The reunion the following day should have been joyful. Jake burst through the hospital waiting room doors, his small face lighting up at the sight of his beloved dog. Max responded with equal enthusiasm, circling the boy with soft whines of happiness, licking every inch of exposed skin he could reach. For several minutes, Jake simply buried his face in the shepherd's ruff, breathing in the familiar scent, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He missed you so much, Helen Wilson told Emma, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Talks about Max constantly, keeps his picture by his bed. But as Jake's initial emotion settled, he became increasingly aware of the hospital setting, the somber faces of the adults, the subtle wrongness of a happy reunion in such a place. Where's Mr. George? He asked finally, looking around the waiting room. Is he sick? The adults exchanged glances, silently debating how much to reveal. It was Emma who answered, with the straightforward honesty children often offer each other. He saved Max from drowning in the storm, but water got in his lungs, and now he has pneumonia. The doctors are giving him medicine, but he's really tired. Jake absorbed this information with the grave acceptance of a child who had recently learned that bad things happen without warning or fairness. Can I see him? I want to thank him for saving Max. After conferring with the nursing staff, they were permitted a brief visit. Jake, his grandparents, Emma, Robert, and, somewhat against hospital policy but allowed given the circumstances, Max. George was awake but weak, his breathing labored despite the oxygen support. Well now, he managed when he saw Jake, if it isn't the young man I've heard so much about. Jake approached the bed with caution, clearly intimidated by the medical equipment but determined nonetheless. Thank you for saving Max, sir. He's my best friend. George's weathered face softened. Wasn't me who did the saving, son. That dog of yours has got more courage than most men I've known. He reached out a trembling hand to pat Max, who had positioned himself between Jake and the bed, as if standing guard over both vulnerable humans. You trained him well. My dad did, Jake corrected quietly. He was teaching me, but I still have a lot to learn. The moment hung heavy with unspoken grief. The boy's loss, the dog who carried the last messages from parents to son, the fragile old veteran who had become unexpectedly entangled in their story. As if sensing the emotional undercurrents, Max suddenly straightened, his ears alert, seconds before the monitors connected to George began to alarm. Dr. Patel rushed in, quickly assessing the situation. I need everyone to step out, please, he ordered, already pressing buttons to silence the shrieking equipment. Nurse, get respiratory down here stat. They retreated to the waiting room, Jake clinging to Max's collar, Emma pale with fear. Through the observation window, they could see medical personnel swarming around George's bed, their urgent movements conveying the seriousness of the situation better than words could have. After what seemed an eternity, Dr. Patel emerged, his expression grave as he approached Robert and the Wilsons. Mr. Parker has suffered a significant setback. His oxygen levels dropped dangerously, and we've had to intubate him, put him on a ventilator to help him breathe. But he'll recover? James Wilson asked, his arm around his grandson's shoulders. Dr. Patel's hesitation was answer enough. We're doing everything we can, but his condition is extremely critical. I would suggest, that is, if there are any arrangements that need to be made, now would be the time to consider them. The adults absorbed this information in stunned silence. It was Jake who spoke, his young voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. Can Max stay with him, please? Max helps people feel better. That's what he's trained for. Dr. Patel glanced at the German shepherd, who sat alert beside Jake, watching the doctor with uncanny focus. "I'm afraid animals aren't permitted in the ICU, young man. There are strict infection control protocols." "Please," Emma joined in, stepping forward. "Max saved Mr. George's life. Maybe he can do it again." The doctor's professional resolve wavered visibly in the face of two children's earnest pleas. "I'll discuss it with the charge nurse. No promises." By evening, an unprecedented compromise had been reached. Max would be permitted brief, supervised visits to George's ICU room after being thoroughly bathed and wearing a special antimicrobial vest provided by a local veterinarian who'd heard the story. The hospital's patient advocate cited numerous studies on the therapeutic benefits of animal companionship, while conveniently overlooking policy strictures about service animals needing to belong to the patient themselves. For 3 days, George's condition remained precariously balanced between life and death. Jake and his grandparents extended their hotel stay, unwilling to return to San Antonio while the situation remained unresolved. Each day, Max was permitted 2 15-minute visits to George's bedside, where he would sit with sphinx-like stillness, amber eyes fixed on the unconscious man's face, occasionally emitting soft whines that seemed to express concern better than human words could manage. On the 4th morning, while Emma and Jake took Max for a walk around the hospital grounds, Robert received the call they had been dreading. George had developed acute respiratory distress syndrome. His lungs were failing despite maximum ventilator support. "We need to discuss end-of-life decisions," Dr. Patel said gently. "Does Mr. Parker have any family who should be contacted?" Robert thought of George's son Thomas, who had called exactly once since his father's hospitalization, expressing concern but explaining that business commitments prevented him from visiting. "I'll make the calls," he promised. Breaking the news to Emma was one of the hardest things Robert had done since telling her about the car accident that took her mother. He found himself using many of the same inadequate phrases. Did everything they could. Not in pain, peaceful end. Emma listened with the stoic expression that had become her armor since Catherine's death, but her small hand sought his, gripping with desperate strength. "Does Jake know?" she asked. "His grandparents are telling him now." Emma nodded, processing this. Max should be there, at the end. Mr. George would want that. "I'll speak to Dr. Patel," Robert promised. The conversation with the Wilsons was equally difficult. Helen wept quietly while James maintained a grim-faced composure, one arm around his wife and the other supporting Jake, who stood unnaturally still, his expression blank with the particular shock of a child encountering mortality too frequently in too short a time. "I want to say goodbye," Jake said finally. "Me and Max both. We have to say thank you for everything." By late afternoon, arrangements had been made. George would be disconnected from life support once medication ensured he would experience no distress. The hospital chaplain would attend, along with Sarah Wilson, Robert, Emma, and, in a final bending of protocol that required the hospital administrator's direct approval, Jake and Max. The shepherd seemed to understand the solemnity of the occasion, entering George's room with unusual quietness, his nails clicking softly on the linoleum floor. Jake guided him to the bedside, where George lay unrecognizable beneath tubes and tape, his chest rising and falling only because machines commanded it. "Mr. George?" Jake's voice wavered. "It's Jake and Max. We came to say goodbye and thank you for being our friend." Max moved forward, gently placing his muzzle on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on George's face with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every feature. A low whine built in his throat, not a sound of distress, but something more complex, almost a communication. The adults maintained a respectful distance, allowing the moment its proper gravity. When the chaplain began a quiet prayer, Emma slipped her hand into her father's, tears streaming silently down her face, for this man who had entered their lives so recently, yet had somehow become an essential part of their unexpected family. As the medical team prepared to remove George's ventilator, Dr. Patel approached the children. "It's time to say your final goodbyes," he said gently. "The nurse will take you to the waiting area while we—" Max suddenly barked, a sharp, authoritative sound that startled everyone in the room. Before anyone could react, the shepherd leapt forward, placing his front paws carefully on the edge of George's bed, his nose inches from the unconscious man's face. He barked again, this time directly at George, the sound urgent and commanding. "Max!" "No!" Jake cried, rushing forward. "You can't!" But the shepherd ignored him, maintaining his position, barking a third time with such force that George's body seemed to vibrate with the sound. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the old veteran's eyelids fluttered. The room froze in collective shock. Dr. Patel rushed to George's bedside, quickly checking vital signs and pupillary responses. Max remained in position, his posture alert but no longer barking, amber eyes fixed intently on George's face. "He's responding," Dr. Patel announced, the professional detachment in his voice cracking slightly. "I don't understand how, but he's fighting the sedation." For several tense minutes, the medical team worked around Max, who refused to be moved despite Jake's gentle tugging at his collar. The German shepherd maintained his vigilant position, occasionally emitting soft whines that seemed to coincide with fluctuations in the monitors tracking George's vital signs. "This is highly irregular," the charge nurse muttered, though she made no actual attempt to remove the dog. By evening, the impossible had occurred. George Parker had not only survived the removal of his ventilator, but was breathing independently with supplemental oxygen. He drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening slightly longer and more lucid than the last. Dr. Patel, unable to explain the sudden reversal through conventional medical understanding, simply documented unexpected patient resilience in the chart. "I've been practicing medicine for 27 years, he told Robert privately, "and I've never seen anything like this. By every medical metric, Mr. Parker's body was shutting down. Then that dog barks, and suddenly he's fighting again? I don't have a scientific explanation." Emma, overhearing this exchange, had her own theory. "Max told him it wasn't time yet," she said with absolute conviction. "He wasn't ready to be alone again." The next morning brought unexpected visitors to the hospital. A silver-haired man in an expensive suit arrived at the nurse's station, flanked by a younger woman clutching a leather portfolio. They asked for George Parker's room with an authority that prompted immediate compliance. Robert, who had stepped out for coffee, returned to find them standing outside George's door, peering through the observation window at the old veteran, who was currently asleep, with Max still maintaining his bedside vigil. Emma had finally been persuaded to return to their temporary housing at the high school for a shower and change of clothes. "Can I help you?" Robert asked, instinctively positioning himself between the strangers and the door. The man turned, assessing Robert with cool professionalism. "William Hargrove," he introduced himself with a crisp handshake. "And this is my associate, Miss Chen. We represent Sentinel K9 Solutions, the company that trained Max." Robert realized aloud. Hargrove's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're familiar with our organization?" "Only through what we've learned about Max in the past weeks. Are you here about the dog?" "Indeed." Hargrove gestured to the window. "That's Asset 342M, one of our most valuable trained search and rescue animals. He went missing during Hurricane Harvey while deployed with his handler. We've been attempting to locate him since." Robert bristled at the clinical description. "His name is Max, and he belongs to a little boy named Jake Wilson. His parents were Michael and Diane Wilson." "Ah." Hargrove exchanged glances with Miss Chen, who promptly opened her portfolio and extracted a document. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Asset 342M, Max, if you prefer, is the property of Sentinel K9 Solutions. The Wilsons were his handlers, employed by our company, but the animal itself remains our intellectual and material property." Robert accepted the document, scanning its dense legal text with the practiced eye of his former profession. "This appears to be a standard employment contract. Page 4, Section 12 outlines ownership rights regarding all canine assets," Miss Chen supplied helpfully. "The Wilsons signed this contract when they joined our organization 3 years ago." Robert continued reading, his heart sinking as he recognized the airtight legal language. According to this document, Max had never belonged to Michael and Diane Wilson, or, by extension, to Jake. The German Shepherd was company property, on loan, to his handlers for the duration of their employment. "What exactly are you here for, Mr. Hargrove?" Robert asked, though he already suspected the answer. "To reclaim our property, naturally. Asset 342M represents a significant investment, over 2 years of specialized training valued at approximately $60,000. Furthermore, his demonstrated capabilities in recent events suggest he may be even more exceptional than our initial assessments indicated. Hargrove consulted his watch. We've arranged transport to our facility in Houston, where he'll receive a complete medical evaluation before being reassigned to a new handler. Reassigned? Robert repeated incredulously. You can't just take him. He's become part of a family. A little boy who has lost both parents depends on that dog. Hargrove's expression remained impassive. While the situation is certainly unfortunate, sentimentality doesn't alter legal reality. The animal is our property. He extracted a business card from his jacket pocket. We're prepared to be reasonable, of course. If the boy's grandparents wish to formally apply to become handlers for Sentinel, we could consider their application, though our standards are extremely rigorous. Robert was still formulating a response when Sarah Wilson arrived, accompanied by Jake and his grandparents. The boy immediately sensed the tension, his eyes darting between the strangers and Robert's troubled expression. What's wrong? Jake asked, instinctively moving closer to his grandfather. Is Mr. George okay? Mr. George is stable, Robert assured him quickly. These people are from the company where your parents worked, the one that trained Max. Recognition dawned on James Wilson's face. Sentinel. Michael mentioned them. Hargrove stepped forward, extending his hand. Mr. Wilson? William Hargrove, Director of Operations at Sentinel Canine Solutions. Please accept our condolences for your loss. Your son was a valued member of our team. James shook the offered hand with visible reluctance. What brings you here, Mr. Hargrove? It's been weeks since the hurricane. Frankly, we've been searching for Asset 342M since your son and daughter-in-law were reported missing. The dog represents a substantial company investment. Helen Wilson made a small distressed sound. Jake looked up at his grandmother, then back at Hargrove, comprehension dawning in his young face. You want to take Max away, he said. Not a question, but a flat statement of terrible understanding. The animal legally belongs to Sentinel, Hargrove confirmed, his tone gentling slightly when addressing the child. He's a working dog, trained for emergency response, not a family pet. Jake's expression hardened in a way that seemed far too adult for his 6 years. My dad said Max was the best partner he ever had. He said Max wasn't just a dog or a tool, he was a hero who saved lives. And we intend to ensure he continues that important work, Hargrove replied smoothly. With a new handler, of course. The conversation might have continued in this vein had George not chosen that moment to awaken, his cardiac monitor registering an increased heart rate as he became aware of the tension in the room. Max immediately turned from the bed to the doorway, placing himself between George and the newcomers, his posture alert but not aggressive. What's all this fuss? George asked hoarsely, his voice still weak but unmistakably lucid. Robert quickly explained the situation, watching George's weathered face darken with each detail. By the time he'd finished, the old veteran was struggling to sit up straighter in his bed. Let me get this straight, George rasped. You folks want to take that dog, who just saved my life, who brought emergency supplies through a hurricane, who's been caring for this boy since he lost his parents, and turn him back into some kind of equipment. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. It's more complicated than. No, sir, it is not, George interrupted with surprising force. Some things in this world are actually quite simple. That dog there, he pointed a trembling finger at Max, has shown more humanity than most people I've met in 72 years on this earth. And you want to treat him like a hammer you've loaned out and now want back? Miss Chen cleared her throat delicately. The legal situation is quite clear, Mr. Parker. The emotional aspects, while understandable, don't change the fundamental property rights at issue. George's monitor beeped a warning as his blood pressure rose. Property rights? That animal has saved at least 3 lives that I know of. He carried the last message from dying parents to their son. He led a little girl through a hurricane to pull me from drowning. Yesterday, he somehow knew I was giving up and barked me back to life. His voice broke slightly. That's not property. That's family. The room fell silent except for the steady rhythm of George's monitors. Jake moved to Max's side, one small hand buried in the shepherd's fur as if anchoring himself against a storm. It was Helen Wilson who finally broke the impasse. With quiet dignity, she opened her purse and withdrew an envelope, handing it to Hargrove. "I believe you'll find this relevant to your claim, Mr. Hargrove." Puzzled, the executive opened the envelope and scanned its contents, his composure faltering visibly. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "It was in the safe deposit box," Helen explained. "The key that was hidden in Max's collar tag, the one mentioned in Michael and Diane's letter. We accessed the box last week." Robert moved closer, curiosity overwhelming professional restraint. "What is it?" "A bill of sale," Hargrove replied stiffly. "Dated 3 months ago. It appears Michael Wilson purchased asset 342M from Sentinel 4. He squinted at the document. $15,000, with the balance to be paid in monthly installments. "My son was buying Max's freedom," James Wilson said quietly. He and Diane were planning to leave Sentinel, start their own training business. They wanted Max to be part of their family officially, not just their working partner. Miss Chen quickly took the document, examining it with professional scrutiny. After a moment, she gave a small nod to Hargrove. "The paperwork appears legitimate, sir. There's also a receipt for the initial payment and signed acceptance from Director Chambers." "Chambers exceeded his authority," Hargrove muttered, though his confident demeanor had cracked. "This should have required board approval for an asset of this value." "Be that as it may," Helen continued, steel entering her gentle voice, "the contract was executed. Max legally belonged to Michael and Diane, and now, as their sole heir, he belongs to Jake." The hospital room seemed to hold its collective breath. Max, sensing the significance of the moment, moved to stand beside Jake, his posture alert but calm, amber eyes watching the proceedings with an intelligence that seemed to comprehend every word. Hargrove finally sighed, straightening his already immaculate tie. "I'll need to consult with our legal department, of course. There may be issues with the remaining payments, which we are prepared to assume responsibility for," James Wilson stated firmly. "Every penny." "We all are," Robert added, surprising himself with the commitment. George nodded emphatic agreement from his hospital bed. Something shifted in Hargrove's expression. Not quite defeat, but a grudging recognition that this particular battle might not be worth fighting. The publicity alone, should the story of Sentinel attempting to take a hero dog from an orphaned child, would be disastrous. "I'll be in touch regarding the payment schedule," he said finally, retrieving the documents from Miss Chen and returning them to Helen. "Sentinel reserves the right to verify the authenticity of these papers." As the executives departed, an almost palpable wave of relief swept through the room. Jake threw his arms around Max's neck, burying his face in the shepherd's fur. "You're really mine now," he whispered. "For real and forever." Max responded with a soft whine, leaning into the embrace with equal emotion, the instinctive bond between boy and dog transcending the human complexities that had nearly separated them. George Parker's recovery defied every medical prognosis. Within 2 weeks, he had progressed from critical condition to sitting up in a chair by the window, grumbling about hospital food and demanding updates on the reconstruction of his driveway. Dr. Patel stopped using the word miracle after the 3rd day, replacing it with more clinical terms like remarkable resilience and unexpected response to treatment. But his expression whenever he examined George suggested he hadn't entirely abandoned the former concept. Max visited daily, always accompanied by either Emma or Jake, sometimes both. The hospital administration, recognizing good publicity when they saw it, had formally waived their restrictions on animal visitors for this particular case. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon the hero dog of Millbrook was featured in regional broadcasts, complete with footage of Max sitting attentively beside George's hospital bed. "All this fuss," George complained to Robert during one afternoon visit, "over an old man being too stubborn to die and a dog doing what he was trained to do." "I think it's a bit more than that," Robert replied, helping George adjust his position in the chair. "People need stories like this after disasters, reminders that good things can happen in the midst of tragedy." George harumphed, but the gruff sound couldn't quite disguise the moisture gathering in his rheumy eyes. "Speaking of good things, what's happening with the boy, Jake?" He and his grandparents heading back to San Antonio soon? Robert hesitated, unsure how much to share of the conversations that had been unfolding between the Wilson family and his own. "They're considering their options," he said carefully. "Jake's school year in San Antonio has already been disrupted, and with Max being so important to him. They are thinking of staying in Millbrook," George concluded flatly, "but that retirement community of theirs doesn't allow dogs." "That's the challenge they're working through," Robert acknowledged. George was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the hospital's small courtyard garden, where autumn flowers were beginning their last colorful display before winter. "My place has 3 bedrooms," he said finally. "Only using one of them. Been that way since Thomas moved out 20 years ago." Robert blinked, uncertain if he was interpreting correctly. "Are you suggesting?" "Not suggesting anything," George interrupted gruffly. "Just stating facts. Got a house too big for one old man. Got a yard Max knows well. Got a school within walking distance." He shrugged as if the conversation held no particular significance. "Just facts." Robert hid a smile. "I'll make sure the Wilsons are aware of these facts." The day George was discharged from the hospital coincided with the reopening of Millbrook Elementary School. The timing wasn't entirely coincidental. Sarah Wilson had lobbied the district superintendent intensely, arguing that returning children to familiar routines was essential for community recovery. The school building had sustained only minor damage during both storms, and teachers had worked overtime to restore classrooms to their pre-disaster conditions. Emma, enrolled as a transfer student, found herself walking through the school's front doors beside Jake, both children unusually quiet with first-day nerves. Robert and James Wilson stood on the sidewalk, watching until the children disappeared inside, before exchanging glances laden with parental concern. "She'll be okay," James assured Robert. "Sarah says she's got them in the same class. They'll look out for each other." Robert nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't entirely dissolve. Emma had experienced too many upheavals in too short a time. Her mother's death, the move to Millbrook, 2 hurricanes, the emotional roller coaster with Max and George. Yet she had shown remarkable resilience through it all. A strength of character that reminded him painfully of Catherine. As the 2 men turned to leave, a familiar German shepherd rose from his waiting position near the school fence. Max had accompanied them on the walk to school, but clearly had no intention of returning home yet. "You planning to wait here all day?" James asked the dog with amused resignation. Max's expressive eyes conveyed something very close to, obviously, before he settled back down, his attention fixed on the school entrance with sphinx-like focus. "I guess we know where to find him at 3 o'clock, Robert said with a chuckle. By Thanksgiving, the new living arrangements had settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural to all involved. George's rambling ranch house accommodated Jake and his grandparents with minimal renovations, mainly safety bars in the bathroom for Helen's arthritis and a wheelchair ramp installed by volunteers from the local VFW post, more for George's bad days than any current necessity. Robert and Emma remained in their rental house, but they were frequent visitors to what Emma had dubbed Max's house, bringing Sunday dinners and helping with repairs still needed after the storms. The German shepherd divided his time between both homes with diplomatic precision, though he always slept at the foot of Jake's bed. The evening before Thanksgiving found them all gathered in George's freshly painted living room. Sarah Wilson had joined them, bringing her grandmother's recipe for pecan pie and news that the school board had approved funding to replace her lost classroom library. Sheriff Mills made a brief appearance, ostensibly to drop off a safety flyer about holiday decorations, but lingering long enough to accept coffee and update them on the county's recovery progress. 97% of displaced residents back in permanent housing, he reported with evident pride. FEMA says we're setting records for community resilience. It's not the government programs, George opined from his recliner, where he sat with Max's head resting companionably on his knee. It's neighbors helping neighbors. Always has been. No one disagreed with this assessment. In the months since Harvey, Millbrook had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for mutual aid, barn raisings reimagined for the modern era, with community members pooling skills, resources, and sheer determination to rebuild what had been lost. After the sheriff departed, they gathered around George's dining table, expanded with 2 card tables to accommodate everyone. Helen had orchestrated a pre-Thanksgiving feast, insisting they needed a practice run before the actual holiday. The rich aromas of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, and simmering cranberry sauce filled the house. As James carved the turkey with ceremonial precision, Jake suddenly set down his water glass with unusual force. "I almost forgot," he exclaimed. "I made something at school. Can I get it, Grandma? It's for the dinner." Helen nodded indulgently, and Jake dashed to his bedroom, returning moments later with a carefully constructed paper centerpiece, a tree with fall-colored leaves, each bearing a handwritten note. "It's a thankful tree," he explained, placing it in the center of the table. "We're supposed to read what we wrote, and maybe add more things we're thankful for." There was a moment of collective pause as the adults absorbed both the craft itself and the emotional significance behind it. Jake had lost more than any child should ever face, yet here he was, focused on gratitude. "That's beautiful, Jake," Sarah said finally, her teacher's voice warm with pride. "Would you like to go first?" Jake nodded solemnly, selecting a red paper leaf from his creation. "I'm thankful for Max," he read, surprising no one. "Because he kept his promise to Mom and Dad and found me, and now he takes care of all of us." At the sound of his name, Max lifted his head from his position near Jake's chair, ears perked forward attentively. "I'm thankful for new friends," Emma read from her yellow leaf, her voice soft but steady, "and for second chances." Around the table, each person took turns reading their contribution. Helen's gratitude for her grandson's resilience, James's appreciation for the community that had embraced them, Sarah's thankfulness for restored classrooms and fresh beginnings, Robert's acknowledgement of new purpose found through unexpected circumstances. George, when his turn came, cleared his throat roughly before reading from a leaf. Jake had helped him prepare. "Thankful for nosy neighbors, stubborn dogs, and the family you find instead of the one you're born with." The simplicity of his words belied their emotional impact. A comfortable silence settled over the table, broken only when Max, perhaps sensing the heightened emotion, rose to make a careful circuit of each chair, pausing to rest his head briefly on each person's knee, a canine blessing of sorts. Later, after dessert had been savored and the dishes washed, they gathered on George's back porch to watch the sunset paint the Texas sky in breathtaking swathes of gold and crimson. Jake and Emma sat on the steps, heads bent together over a notebook where they were designing improvements for Max's doghouse, a project that had expanded to include solar-powered heating pads and automated water dispensers, most of which would never materialize, but provided endless entertainment in the planning. Robert found himself standing beside George at the porch railing, both men nursing cups of after-dinner coffee as they watched the children. "Catherine would have loved this," Robert said quietly, the mention of his late wife no longer carrying the sharp-edged pain of earlier months. She always wanted Emma to have the kind of childhood with extended family, grandparent figures, cousins running in and out. George nodded, understanding the unspoken significance of Robert sharing this particular regret. "Not exactly how any of us planned it," he observed dryly. "But family's family, however you come by it." From the yard below, Max suddenly barked, not his alert bark, but the playful sound they had all come to recognize as his invitation to engage. Jake immediately abandoned the notebook and ran down the steps, the German shepherd bouncing around him with puppyish enthusiasm despite his adult size and dignity. Emma followed a moment later, her initial hesitation giving way to laughter as Max included her in his exuberant game. The adults watched as the children and dog chased each other across the twilit yard, their movements casting long shadows against the fence. None of them were the same people they had been before the storms, before a German shepherd had dragged a canvas bag through flooded streets with single-minded determination, before tragedy and heroism had collided to create something new from the wreckage of what was lost. Helen appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. "Should we call them in? It's getting dark." "Let them play a bit longer," Robert suggested, something in his chest expanding with quiet joy as he watched his daughter's uninhibited happiness. They're making memories. As if hearing these words, Max paused in his romping to look back at the porch, his intelligent eyes meeting Robert's across the yard. In that moment of connection, Robert felt an almost palpable understanding pass between man and dog, an acknowledgement of wounds healed, promises kept, and the mysterious ways that love transcends species, circumstance, and even disaster. Max gave a soft woof as if confirming this unspoken exchange, then turned back to the children, herding them gently in their play, guardian, friend, and family member all at once. The dog who had carried messages from the dead to the living, who had traveled impossible distances through hurricane waters, who had barked an old man back to life, now dedicated himself to a simpler but equally vital mission, protecting the joy of those who had become his pack. And in Millbrook, Texas, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, that seemed miracle enough for anyone. In the twilight of our lives, it's easy to believe our most meaningful chapters have already been written. Yet as George Parker discovered, sometimes our greatest purpose finds us when we least expect it. Through the extraordinary journey of Max, a loyal German shepherd, we're reminded that family isn't always defined by blood, but by those who stand beside us when storms rage. We may find ourselves like George, alone, set in our ways, believing our best contributions are behind us, until unexpected connections reveal the wisdom and strength we still have to offer. Life's second acts often arrive disguised as disruptions or disasters. The hurricane that devastated Millbrook became the catalyst for healing, bringing together the broken pieces of different lives to create something whole. Remember, it's never too late to open your door to new possibilities, to be the steady hand that guides a child through grief, or to discover that your experience and heart are still desperately needed in this world. The most beautiful gardens sometimes grow in the aftermath of the most devastating storms. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.